Fire her. The words came out cold, flat, final. Richard Cole didn't even look up from the security monitor as he said it, his voice echoing softly against the glass walls of his home office, a space too large for a man who hadn't slept in weeks. The screen in front of him glowed in the dim light, a grid of silent black and white feeds capturing every inch of the mansion, polished marble floors reflecting the faint blue hue of the cameras, long hallways stretching empty and still, except for one frame in the upper corner where something didn't belong. A woman. On the floor. Richard's fingers paused over the edge of his desk, his jaw tightening slightly as he leaned closer, eyes narrowing at the image. Ava Johnson. The new hire. 3 days in the house, and already crossing boundaries. She wasn't supposed to be in the nursery at this hour. She wasn't supposed to be anywhere near his son without permission. And she definitely wasn't supposed to be asleep. On the floor. His gaze hardened as he adjusted the angle, zooming in just enough for the details to sharpen. The nursery lamp cast a low amber glow across the room, soft and dim, barely touching the corners where shadows pooled like quiet secrets. The crib stood still in the center, untouched, empty. That was the first thing that made him frown. Slowly, almost reluctantly, his eyes shifted downward. The baby wasn't in the crib. Ethan was on the floor. Not alone. The woman lay beside him, her body curled slightly toward his son, one arm bent under her head, the other resting lightly across her own chest, as if she were holding herself still. The baby was tucked against her side, wrapped loosely in a thin blanket, his tiny hand gripping the fabric of her sleeve. Richard's breath caught, not sharp, not loud, just enough to interrupt the steady rhythm he had forced himself into all night. The crying had stopped. That realization settled in a second later, heavier than anything else. For the first time in days, there was no sound. No sharp, desperate wails echoing through the house. No restless pacing from exhausted staff. No muted frustration behind closed doors. Just silence. Real silence. The kind that didn't feel empty, but full. He straightened slowly, his chair creaking beneath him, the sound oddly intrusive in the stillness of the room. Something about the image didn't match what he expected. He had seen dozens of caregivers come through this house in the past month alone, trained, certified, recommended by the best agencies money could buy. None of them lasted. None of them could calm Ethan for more than a few minutes. They followed instructions, schedules, techniques, and still the nights stretched on, endless and loud. But this made no sense. She wasn't doing anything. No rocking, no whispering, no movement at all. Just lying there, breathing. Richard leaned in again, closer this time, his eyes tracking the smallest details. The rise and fall of her chest, slow, steady, deliberate. Not the deep, unconscious rhythm of sleep, but something controlled, measured, intentional. And then he saw it. Ethan's breathing matched hers. Not perfectly, not yet, but close enough to make his chest tighten in a way he couldn't explain. The baby's small body, once tense and restless, now moved in soft, even patterns, his face relaxed, his fingers no longer clutching at the air in panic. Richard exhaled quietly, though he hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. The command he had given just seconds ago, fire her, hung in the air behind him, suddenly misplaced, like it belonged to a different moment, a different version of himself. His hand moved to the intercom, hovering there for a brief second before stopping. He didn't press it. Instead, he stood. The room around him felt colder as he stepped away from the desk, the soft hum of electronics fading behind him. The hallway lights dimmed automatically as he walked, each step measured, quiet against the polished floor. Upstairs, the house remained still, wrapped in that same unfamiliar calm. He reached the nursery door and paused, his hand resting against the cool metal handle. For a moment, he didn't move. He just listened. Nothing. No crying. No movement. Just a soft, almost imperceptible rhythm on the other side. Slowly, he turned the handle and opened the door just enough to look inside. The warm light spilled into the hallway, brushing against his face as his eyes adjusted. And there they were, exactly as the camera had shown. Ava on the floor, his son beside her, both still, both quiet. But being there, seeing it with his own eyes, felt different. Closer, realer. The floor beneath them was cold marble, unforgiving, nothing like the expensive crib he had chosen. Nothing like the soft bedding designed for comfort. Yet Ethan slept. Not the restless, fragile sleep he had grown used to. This was deeper, peaceful. Ava's eyes were closed, but something about her posture told him she wasn't fully asleep. Her body remained slightly tense, as if ready to respond at the smallest change. She didn't belong there. Not by his rules. Not by any standard he had set. And yet, for the first time since the house had filled with silence that felt like failure, this silence felt different. Richard stepped just inside the doorway, careful, controlled, as if even the sound of his breath might break whatever fragile balance was holding the room together. He looked down at his son again, at the steady rise of his chest, at the way his tiny fingers still clung to the edge of Ava's sleeve, and something inside him shifted, quietly, almost imperceptibly, but enough that the word he had spoken earlier no longer felt certain. Not yet. Richard did not speak when he stepped fully into the nursery, and somehow the room seemed to notice, holding its breath around him, as if even the air understood that something fragile was happening on the floor beneath that soft amber light. He closed the door behind him with careful precision, the latch clicking so quietly it almost sounded imagined, and for a long second he simply stood there, tall and unmoving, a man used to commanding entire rooms now unsure of where to place his own hands. His gaze drifted again to Ava, tracing the small details he had missed on the monitor, the faint crease in her uniform where the fabric pressed against the marble, the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers curled slightly inward as if resisting the urge to move. She was not comfortable, that much was obvious. The floor was cold, unyielding, nothing like the plush surroundings that filled every other corner of his home. And yet she had chosen to be there, not for herself, but for a child who was not hers. Ethan stirred slightly. Just a shift, a small exhale that might have turned into a cry on any other night. And Richard felt his chest tighten instinctively, his body preparing for the sound that had haunted every hour of darkness for weeks. But it did not come. Instead, Ava's breathing adjusted, so subtly it would have been invisible to anyone not looking for it. A fraction slower, a fraction deeper, and Ethan followed, his tiny chest rising in quiet synchronization. Richard's brow furrowed, confusion threading through the control he prided himself on. Because this was not technique, it was not training, it was something else, something quieter, something he could not quantify or purchase or instruct. He took one step closer, then another, the soft soles of his shoes making no sound, against the floor, until he stood just a few feet away from them, close enough to see the faint shimmer of moisture at the corner of Ava's eye. Not tears, not quite, but something that had lingered there before sleep or whatever this state was had taken hold. His gaze shifted to Ethan again, really looking this time, not as a problem to be solved or a responsibility to be managed, but as a child, small and vulnerable. His features softened in a way Richard had not seen since before everything changed, before the house grew too quiet in all the wrong ways. A memory flickered, uninvited and sharp, of nights when the silence had meant peace, when laughter had filled these walls instead of tension, and he pushed it down quickly, as he always did, but it left something behind, a crack in the carefully constructed distance he kept between himself and anything he could not control. Ava shifted slightly, not enough to wake fully, but enough that her hand moved an inch closer to Ethan, hovering just above his back, not touching, just present, like a promise she did not need to say out loud. Richard noticed the restraint in that gesture, the discipline, as if she understood that too much movement might break whatever fragile rhythm she had created, and that realization unsettled him more than anything else, because it meant she was not acting on instinct alone. She was aware, deliberate, choosing each still second for the sake of his son. His hand lifted slightly, almost without his permission, as if he might reach down, adjust the blanket, do something, anything. But he stopped himself, the motion freezing halfway before slowly lowering again, because for once, his interference did not feel necessary. The room remained still, wrapped in that quiet, and Richard found himself listening, not for noise, but for absence, for the lack of chaos that had become so familiar it felt like part of the structure of the house itself. He exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, and stepped back just enough to lean lightly against the wall, his posture losing a fraction of its rigid edge. Minutes passed, or maybe longer, time moving differently in a space where nothing demanded urgency. And he stayed there, watching, observing, learning something he could not yet name. Eventually, Ava's eyes opened, not with a start, not in confusion, but slowly, as if she had been aware of his presence long before she chose to acknowledge it. Her gaze lifted to meet his, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with something unspoken. She did not move immediately, did not pull away or scramble to stand. She only shifted her eyes briefly to Ethan, confirming he was still sleeping, before looking back at Richard. There was no defiance in her expression, no fear either, just a quiet steadiness that caught him off guard. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, careful, as if even words needed to be handled gently in this room. "I am sorry, sir," she said, each word measured, not rushed. He would not settle in the crib. Her eyes dropped briefly, then lifted again. "I did not want him to feel alone." Richard did not respond right away. The expected reaction, the one he had practiced for years, seemed suddenly out of place, too loud for what he had just witnessed. Instead, he looked at his son again, then back at her, and something in his expression shifted, subtle but undeniable, as the certainty he carried into the room continued to unravel, piece by quiet piece. Richard's silence did not break immediately, and that was what unsettled Ava more than anything else, because she had already prepared herself for the usual outcome. The sharp dismissal, the reminder of her place, the quiet escort out of a room she was never meant to enter. But instead he just stood there, looking at Ethan, then at her, as if trying to understand something that did not fit into the rules he had built his life around. The seconds stretched, thin and fragile, and Ava carefully shifted her weight, slow enough not to disturb the sleeping child, her body stiff from the cold marble. Beneath her, every muscle aware of his presence now. But she did not pull away from Ethan, not yet, not until she was certain he would remain calm. Richard finally moved, but not in the way she expected. He stepped closer, then lowered himself slightly, not fully kneeling, not yet, but enough that the distance between them changed, enough that he could see more clearly the small details that had escaped him before, the faint dark circles beneath her eyes, the subtle tremor in her fingers that she tried to still, the way she kept her breathing steady even now, as if she knew Ethan might follow it at any moment. "How?" he said quietly, the word leaving him without the sharpness his voice usually carried, more question than command, and Ava blinked once, caught off guard, because no one had asked her that before, not here, not in this house where she was expected to move silently and leave no trace. She glanced down at Ethan, then back at Richard, choosing her words carefully. "He listens," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Not to words, but to rhythm, to presence. She paused, watching Richard's expression for any sign of impatience. But there was none, only a focused stillness that made her continue. When everything around him feels too big, too loud, he looks for something steady. Her hand hovered again near Ethan's back, not touching, just close enough to remind him she was there. "So I give him that." Richard's brow tightened slightly, not in anger, but in concentration, as if he were trying to translate something unfamiliar into a language he understood. "You just lie there," he said, the phrasing blunt but not dismissive, and Ava nodded once, a small motion. "Yes, sir," she replied. I slowed down, and he follows. The simplicity of it seemed almost absurd in the context of everything Richard had tried, the specialists, the schedules, the precise routines designed to solve a problem that now appeared, in this quiet moment, less like a problem and more like a need he had failed to recognize. Ethan shifted again, a soft sound escaping him, and both of them stilled instantly, Ava's breathing deepening by a fraction, her focus narrowing entirely on the child beside her, and Richard watched as the tension passed without rising, the moment dissolving back into calm. Something in his chest tightened, not with frustration, but with a strange, unfamiliar awareness, as if he were seeing not just what was happening, but what had been missing all along. "Why the floor?" he asked after a moment, his voice quieter now, almost cautious, and Ava hesitated, not because she did not have an answer, but because she was not sure how it would be received. "The crib separates him," she said finally. her eyes flicking briefly to the empty structure behind them. It is safe, but it is also alone. She swallowed lightly, then continued. Down here, he can feel someone near him, not above him, not out of reach. Richard followed her gaze to the crib, the expensive design suddenly looking distant, almost clinical, and for the first time he considered it not as a solution, but as a barrier. Ava shifted slightly, wincing almost imperceptibly as the cold pressed into her side, and Richard noticed, his eyes lingering on the thin layer of fabric between her and the unforgiving floor. And a quiet realization settled in. She had chosen discomfort without hesitation, not for recognition, not for approval, but because it worked. You could have called someone, he said, though even as he spoke, the words felt hollow, and Ava shook her head gently. He had already cried for a long time, she said, her voice steady but carrying a weight that suggested more than just this night. Sometimes calling more people makes it louder, not better. Richard exhaled slowly, the truth of that statement landing heavier than he expected, because he had filled this house with people, with solutions, with noise disguised as help, and still his son had cried. The silence that followed was different now, no longer just the absence of sound, but something fuller, something that demanded attention rather than avoidance. Ava finally began to shift, carefully sliding her arm away from beneath her head, preparing to sit up, her movements deliberate so as not to wake Ethan, but before she could fully rise, Richard spoke again, his voice low, almost uncertain. Do not, he said, and she paused immediately, her eyes lifting to his in quiet confusion. He glanced at Ethan, then back at her, and the next words came slower, as if he were choosing each one with more care than he was used to. Do not move him, he clarified, and Ava held still, her posture softening slightly as she settled back into place. Richard remained where he was, not returning to the doorway, not reclaiming the distance that had defined every interaction before this moment, but staying there, close enough to see, to listen, to learn, and for the first time since the night had begun, he did not feel the need to control what was happening in the room, only to understand it. Richard stayed where he was, the quiet stretching around the three of them like something alive, something fragile that neither of them wanted to disturb, and for the first time in a long while he allowed himself to remain still without searching for the next solution, the next fix, the next instruction to give. The house beyond the nursery walls felt distant now, its vastness reduced to silence, to soft air and dim light, and the slow, steady rhythm of a child finally at rest. Ava did not move. After his words, her body settling back into the exact position that had brought Ethan this calm, her breathing returning to that measured cadence. But inside, a different rhythm stirred, one of uncertainty, because this moment did not follow the pattern she had learned to expect. There was no correction, no reprimand, only observation, and that unsettled her more than any raised voice could have. Minutes passed, long enough for the edges of tension to soften but not disappear entirely, and Richard's gaze remained fixed, not on Ava alone, but on the connection between her and his son, something invisible yet undeniable, something he had not been able to create despite everything he had provided. He shifted his weight slightly, his shoulder brushing the wall behind him, and for a brief second he closed his eyes, not in exhaustion, but in recognition, as if something he had been avoiding had finally caught up with him in the quiet. When he opened them again, the room felt different. Or perhaps it was him that had changed. Does he always do this? He asked quietly, his voice low enough that it seemed to belong to the room rather than interrupt it. And Ava understood the question without needing clarification, her eyes still on Ethan as she answered. Only when he feels safe, she said, the words simple, but carrying a weight that lingered in the air after she spoke. Them, Richard absorbed that, his jaw tightening slightly, not in resistance, but in thought, because safety, in his world, had always meant control, protection, structure, and yet here, on a cold marble floor, none of those things were present in the way he had defined them, and still his son rested more peacefully than he had in weeks. He took another step forward, slowly lowering himself until he was closer to their level, not fully on the ground, but no longer standing above them either, and that shift, subtle as it was, altered something in the space between them. Ava noticed, though she did not react outwardly, her attention still anchored to the child beside her, but aware of every movement Richard made. "What happens if you leave?" he asked after a moment, the question softer now, less like an inquiry and more like a concern he was not used to voicing. Ava hesitated briefly, her eyes flicking to Ethan's face, then back to the steady rise and fall of his chest. "He wakes," she said honestly. "Not right away, but he feels it." Her hand hovered again, instinctively, as if illustrating something words could not fully explain. "It is not the noise that wakes him. It is the absence." Richard's gaze dropped to Ethan, the concept settling into him with quiet force, because absence was something he understood too well, though he rarely allowed himself to name it. A faint sound echoed somewhere down the hall, distant and insignificant, but enough to make Ava's body still for a fraction of a second, her awareness sharpening, and Richard saw it, saw how quickly she adjusted, how completely her attention remained on Ethan even as the world beyond the room shifted. "You have done this before," he said, not a question this time, and Ava's expression softened almost imperceptibly, a shadow passing through her eyes, something deeper than the moment they were in. "Yes, sir," she replied quietly, her voice steady but carrying something unspoken beneath it. Richard did not press further, not yet, but the answer stayed with him, adding another layer to what he was beginning to understand. The air in the room felt warmer now, or perhaps it was simply that the tension had eased enough for him to notice it. The soft glow of the lamp casting gentle light across Ethan's face, highlighting the calm that had been so elusive. Richard lowered himself a little more, his hand resting lightly against the edge of a nearby chair for balance, his posture no longer rigid, no longer distant, and for the first time he allowed himself to remain in that position without feeling the need to reclaim control. Ava shifted slightly to ease the pressure on her arm, the movement small and careful, and Richard's eyes followed, not with judgment, but with awareness, recognizing the quiet endurance it required to stay there, to remain still for the sake of someone else. The silence deepened again, but this time it did not feel like something to fill. It felt like something to respect, and Richard found himself listening, not just to the absence of sound, but to the presence of something he had overlooked for too long. He looked at Ava once more, really looked, not as an employee, not as a role within his household, but as a person who had stepped into a space he could not reach and had brought something back. With her, something he did not yet fully understand but could no longer ignore. And as he stayed there, close enough to see the subtle rise and fall of his son's breathing, close enough to feel the quiet steadiness that Ava held without effort or demand, the certainty he had carried into the night continued to dissolve, replaced by a question he had never thought to ask himself before, not about what he could provide, but about what he had been missing all along. Richard did not realize how long he had been standing there until the faint shift of light outside the tall windows began to change the tone of the room, the deep night slowly softening into the earliest hint of morning, a pale gray filtering through the edges of the curtains and blending with the warm amber glow of the nursery lamp. Time had moved, quietly and without permission, while he remained fixed in a moment he could not explain, and for once, he had not tried to control it. Ava felt it, too. The subtle transition, the quiet signal that the world beyond the room was beginning again, but she did not move, not yet, because Ethan's breathing remained steady, his small body still anchored to that fragile rhythm they had built together. Richard shifted slightly, his muscles stiff from holding a position he was not used to, and the faint sound of fabric against what seemed louder than it should have been, drawing his attention back to the present. He looked down again at his son, really looked, noticing details he had overlooked before, the softness in his expression, the absence of tension in his tiny hands, the way his fingers no longer searched for something to hold on to, because they had already found it. Something in Richard's chest tightened again, not with urgency, but with recognition, a slow, quiet realization that what he had been trying to fix might not have been broken in the way he thought. Ava carefully adjusted her breathing as Ethan shifted slightly, a small movement that might have turned into restlessness on any other night, but instead settled again, guided by the steady rhythm she maintained. She was aware of Richard watching, aware of the weight of his attention, but she did not let it change what she was doing, because the child beside her Needed consistency more than anything else. Does it always take this long? Richard asked after a while, his voice softer now, less controlled, more uncertain, and Ava considered the question before answering. Choosing honesty over comfort. Sometimes longer, she said quietly. Sometimes shorter. It depends on how alone he feels before he comes to rest. The words lingered, settling into the space between them, and Richard felt them land deeper than he expected, because alone was not a condition he had ever associated with something he could solve with money or structure. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than it came in, and for a moment he closed his eyes again, not to escape, but to process, to sit with something he had spent weeks avoiding. When he opened them, Ava was still there, unchanged in her quiet focus, her presence steady in a way that did not demand recognition. And that steadiness began to feel less like an anomaly and more like something essential. You said you have done this before, he said, his voice low, careful, as if stepping into unfamiliar ground, and Ava's expression shifted slightly, a subtle tightening at the edges, not resistance, but memory. She did not answer immediately, her gaze remaining on Ethan as if grounding herself in the present before allowing the past to surface. Yes, sir, she said. Finally, her voice steady but softer now. My son. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that filled the room more than any explanation could have, and Richard felt it, felt the quiet gravity of something deeper than the moment they were sharing. He did not interrupt, did not question, and Ava continued after a brief pause. He used to cry like this, she said, her hand hovering again, instinctively mirroring the memory she spoke from. Not because he was hurt, but because he could not feel anyone near him, even when they were there. Her voice did not break, but it softened, the edges worn smooth by time and repetition. So I learned to stay, to be still, to let him find me without words. Richard listened, really listened, not as a man gathering information, but as someone beginning to understand the shape of something he had been missing, and in that understanding, a quiet discomfort began to form, not directed at Ava, but at himself. He glanced at Ethan again, at the small, peaceful figure on the floor, and then at the empty crib behind them. The distance between those two images suddenly more significant than he had ever considered. And it worked, he said, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement, and Ava nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion. It helped, she replied, her choice of words careful, not claiming certainty, only presence. The room fell silent again. But this silence was different from the ones before. It was filled with understanding, with connections forming quietly beneath the surface. Richard shifted slightly, then did something he had not done in years without thinking about it first. He lowered himself fully to the floor, the cold marble pressing through his clothes, unfamiliar and grounding at the same time. And he remained there, not speaking, not directing, just present. Close enough now to feel the faint warmth that lingered around his son, close enough to understand that whatever had changed in this room had not come from control, but from something far simpler and far more difficult for him to accept. Ava noticed the movement, her eyes flicking to him for a brief second before returning to Ethan, and in that brief glance, there was no surprise, only a quiet acknowledgement, as if she had been waiting for that shift without expecting it. The morning light grew a little stronger, soft and pale against the walls, and Richard remained where he was, no longer standing above the moment, but inside it. And as he listened to the steady rhythm of his son's breathing, matched by the quiet presence beside him, he realized that for the first time, he was not trying to fix the silence. He was learning how to be part of it. The marble floor was colder than Richard expected, the chill pressing through the fabric of his tailored pants in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost intrusive, but he did not move. Not this time, because for once discomfort did not feel like something to escape. It felt like something to understand. He adjusted his position slightly, careful not to disturb the quiet balance in the room, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if he were learning a language he had never needed before. Beside him, Ethan's breathing remained steady, soft and even, each rise and fall a quiet reassurance that the fragile rhythm still held, and Richard found himself matching it without thinking, his own breath gradually slowing, sinking in a way that felt almost involuntary. Ava noticed it first, not by looking at him, but by feeling the subtle shift in the space around them, the air itself settling into a calmer pattern. And though she did not turn her head, there was a quiet awareness in her posture, a recognition that something had changed. The early morning light crept further into the room, pale and soft, touching the edges of the crib, the walls, the floor where they sat, and Richard followed its path briefly before returning his focus to his son, as if everything else had become secondary to this single, quiet moment. "Does he need this every night?" he asked after a while, his voice low, almost careful. And Ava took a second before answering, her gaze still on Ethan. "Not always," she said, "but when he feels it building, when the quiet starts to feel empty instead of safe, then yes." She paused, choosing her next words with care. "He needs someone to stay long enough for the feeling to pass." Richard absorbed that, his mind instinctively trying to categorize it, to define it in terms he understood. But the more he listened, the more he realized that what Ava described did not fit into any system he had relied on before. He glanced at her then, really looked again, not just at what she was doing, but at how she carried it, the patience, the steadiness, the absence of urgency, and something in him shifted again, deeper this time, because he began to see not just the action, but the cost behind it, the quiet endurance it required. "You have been here 3 days, he said, not as a question, but as a statement that carried a new kind of weight, and Ava nodded slightly. "Yes, sir." Her voice remained soft, but there was a quiet firmness in it now, a sense of presence that had not been there when she first arrived in this house. Richard exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting back to Ethan. "And in 3 days, you have done what no one else could." The words came out quieter than he intended, almost to himself, and Ava did not respond right away, because she understood something he did not yet fully say, that it was not about what she had done, but how she had done it. "I did not fix him," she said gently after a moment, her voice steady. "I just stayed with him." The simplicity of that statement settled into the room with a quiet force, and Richard felt it, not as a challenge, but as a realization that reshaped something in his thinking. He had been trying to fix, to correct, to manage, while what his son needed was something far less complicated and far more difficult to give. A faint sound echoed again from somewhere in the house, a door closing in the distance. The beginning of morning routines stirring beyond the nursery walls, but inside the room, nothing changed. The calm held, anchored by the quiet presence they had built together. Richard shifted slightly, his hand brushing against the floor, feeling the cool surface beneath his palm, grounding him in a way he had not expected, and for a moment he let his hand rest there, not moving, just feeling, just being. Ava adjusted her breathing again as Ethan stirred, the movement small but enough to require attention, and Richard watched closely this time, not as an observer looking for answers, but as someone learning through presence, seeing how she responded without urgency, without force, just a subtle shift, a quiet reassurance that did not need words. Ethan settled again, his small body relaxing, and Richard felt something in his chest loosen, a tension he had carried for so long it had become part of him, now easing without the usual struggle. He looked at Ava once more, and this time when he spoke, there was something different in his tone, something less guarded, less certain. "Show me," he said quietly, the word simple, but carrying a weight that changed their meaning entirely. Ava's eyes lifted to meet his for a brief moment, and in that glance there was no surprise, only a quiet understanding, as if she had been waiting for that request without expecting it to come. She nodded once, slowly, then returned her focus to Ethan, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged, and Richard followed, not immediately, not perfectly, but with intention, adjusting his own breath to match the rhythm she held, the movement unfamiliar, almost awkward at first, but he did not stop. The room remained quiet, the morning light growing stronger, and for the first time since the night had begun, Richard was not standing outside the moment trying to control it. He was inside it, learning how to stay. Richard focused on his breathing the way Ava had shown him, not by instruction, not by correction, but by quiet example. And at first it felt unnatural, forced, like trying to slow something that had always moved too fast. But he did not stop, because for once he was not trying to master the moment. He was trying to stay inside it. The air in the room seemed to respond, Or maybe it was just his awareness sharpening. But each inhale felt deeper, each exhale longer, and beside him, Ethan's chest continued to rise and fall in that same steady rhythm, as if the small body between them was anchoring both of them in place. Ava remained still, her presence unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her attention now, a quiet expansion, as if she were no longer holding the space alone, as if she could feel Richard beginning to share it, not perfectly, not fully, but enough to matter. Minutes passed without words, and in that silence, something unspoken began to form, a connection not built on conversation or instruction, but on shared presence, on the simple act of not leaving. Richard became aware of details he would have dismissed before, the faint sound of Ethan's breath brushing against the fabric of the blanket, the soft warmth radiating from the child's small body, the almost imperceptible way Ava adjusted her breathing when Ethan shifted, not reacting, but guiding. He followed her lead, not by copying exactly, but by listening, by allowing his own rhythm to align with what was already there, and for the first time, he understood that this was not about control, it was about consistency, about staying steady long enough for someone else to find their way to calm. Ethan stirred again, a slightly deeper movement this time, his fingers loosening their grip before curling again, and Richard felt a flicker of tension rise in his chest, an old instinct, the anticipation of noise, of disruption. But Ava did not move, not immediately. Her breathing remained slow, even, grounded, and after a second, Richard resisted the urge to intervene, to reach, to fix, and instead he stayed, letting the moment unfold without interference. The tension passed, as quietly as it had come, and Ethan settled again, his breathing returning to its soft, steady pattern, and something in Richard's chest shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to register, enough to make him realize that his instinct to act had not been necessary, that sometimes staying was enough. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him with a quiet sense of release, and without thinking, his hand moved slightly closer to Ethan, stopping just short of contact, hovering in the same way Ava's had earlier, present but not intrusive, and he held it there, uncertain at first, then more steady, as if learning where the boundary between presence and disruption truly lay. Ava noticed the movement, her eyes flicking briefly toward his hand, then back to Ethan, and there was a faint softening in her expression, not approval, not praise, just recognition, as if she understood the significance of that small, hesitant gesture. The light in the room continued to shift, growing brighter, more defined. The early morning now fully beginning to take shape beyond the windows. But inside the nursery, time still felt suspended, held in the quiet space they had created together. He feels it, Ava said softly after a while, her voice barely above a whisper, and Richard turned his head slightly, listening. Not just what you do, but how you are, she continued, her words simple, but layered with meaning. If you are tense, he feels that. If you are calm, he follows. Richard absorbed that, his gaze returning to Ethan, then to his own hand, still hovering, still steady, and he adjusted his breath again, consciously this time, allowing the tension in his shoulders to ease, allowing the stillness to settle deeper. I have been, he began, then paused, the words catching unfamiliar, because he was not used to speaking from this place, not used to acknowledging something he could not measure or control. 2. He stopped again, searching, and Ava did not interrupt, did not fill the silence. She simply remained, giving him the space to find the words on his own. Far. He finished quietly, the word landing heavier than he expected, and Ava did not respond immediately, because she understood that this was not a statement meant for her, but for himself. Richard looked at Ethan again, really looked, and for the first time, he did not see a problem to solve, or a responsibility to manage. He saw a child who needed something he had not been giving. Not because he did not care, but because he had not known how. The realization did not come with guilt, not fully, but with something quieter, something more constructive, a shift in understanding that felt less like failure and more like possibility. Ava adjusted her breathing once more as Ethan shifted slightly, and this time, without thinking, Richard followed, his breath aligning with hers, steady and calm, and the moment held, not because he controlled it, but because he chose to stay within it. The room remained quiet, filled with a stillness that no longer felt unfamiliar. And as Richard sat there on the cold marble floor, close enough to feel the warmth of his son, close enough to hear the rhythm of his breathing, he began to understand that what he was learning was not a technique, not a method, but something far simpler and far more difficult, the act of being present without trying to change what was already enough. The word lingered in the air longer than either of them expected, not loud, not heavy, but quiet in a way that made it impossible to ignore, and Ava felt it settle somewhere deeper than the room, not as a confession directed at her, but as something Richard had finally allowed himself to hear. She did not respond right away, because she understood that some moments did not need answers, they needed space. And so she remained still, her breathing steady, her presence unchanged, allowing the silence to hold what had just been said without rushing to fill it. Richard kept his eyes on Ethan, but his focus had shifted inward, the realization of being too far, unfolding in layers he had not anticipated, not just distance and space, but distance in presence, in attention, in the quiet moments he had handed over to others because he believed that was what providing meant. The morning light grew stronger now, stretching across the floor in soft lines, touching the edges of Ethan's blanket, catching faintly on Ava's sleeve, illuminating the small details that had gone unnoticed in the night. And in that light, everything felt clearer, sharper, more real. Ethan stirred again, a small movement of his head, a soft exhale that carried just a hint of restlessness, and Richard felt it immediately, not as alarm this time, but as awareness, his body responding differently now, not tightening, but softening, preparing to stay rather than react. Ava adjusted her breathing once more, subtle, precise, and Richard followed without hesitation, his inhale slowing, his exhale lengthening, and for a brief moment their rhythms aligned perfectly, a quiet synchronization that seemed to settle over Ethan like a gentle weight, guiding him back into stillness. The child's fingers loosened slightly, releasing their hold on Ava's sleeve before curling again, this time more relaxed, and Richard watched it happen with a focus that bordered on reverence, as if he were witnessing something delicate and easily broken. He shifted his hand a little closer, still hovering, still careful, and this time he let it remain there, not as an instinct, but as a choice, a quiet commitment to be present without disrupting what had already been established. Ava noticed the steadiness in that gesture, the absence of urgency, and though she did not speak, there was a faint easing in her posture, a recognition that he was no longer resisting the moment. He was participating in it. The house beyond the nursery had begun to wake fully now. Distant footsteps, the faint hum of activity returning to its usual rhythm, but inside the room, that world felt separate, muted as if the door had become a boundary not just for sound, but for everything that did not belong to this quiet space. He will wake soon, Ava said softly after a while, her voice gentle, careful not to disturb the calm they had built, and Richard nodded slightly, though he did not take his eyes off Ethan. And when he does, she continued, he will look for what he felt before he slept. The words were simple, but they carried an instruction within them, one that did not need to be stated directly. Richard understood, not fully, not yet, but enough to feel the weight of what would come next, because staying now was one thing, but being there when Ethan opened his eyes was something else entirely. He exhaled slowly, his breath steady, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not to withdraw, but to anchor himself in the rhythm he had begun to learn, and when he opened them again, there was a quiet resolve in his expression, not forced, not declared, but present. Ethan shifted once more, a deeper movement this time, his small body stretching slightly, his breathing changing just enough to signal the edge of waking, and Ava adjusted again, her presence becoming a little more active, though still controlled, still calm, and Richard followed, not perfectly, but with intention, his hand lowering just enough to rest lightly against the floor near Ethan, grounding himself in the moment. The baby's eyes fluttered faintly, not opening yet, but close, and Richard felt a subtle tension rise, not from fear, but from anticipation, because this would be different. This would be the moment where everything they had held together in stillness would be tested. Ava's voice came again, softer now, almost a whisper carried by breath rather than sound. "Do not rush him," she said, her words gentle but firm. "Let him find you." Richard nodded once, barely a movement, his focus narrowing entirely on his son, on the small changes in his expression, the slight tightening of his fingers, the way his breathing shifted as consciousness slowly returned. The room held steady, the light continuing to grow, the quiet deepening rather than breaking. And as Ethan hovered on the edge of waking, Richard remained exactly where he was, no longer outside the moment, no longer observing from a distance, but present, steady, close enough that when his son finally opened his eyes, there would be something there waiting for him that had not been there before. Ethan's eyes opened slowly, not all at once, but in soft, uncertain stages, like someone stepping into a room they were not sure was still safe, his lashes fluttering against the morning light as his small body remained still, listening before reacting. And for a brief moment, there was nothing but quiet awareness in his gaze. Richard felt it immediately, the shift from sleep to waking, the fragile space where everything could either hold or break, and his instinct rose again, that familiar urge to move, to speak, to do something, anything. But Ava's words echoed in the silence. "Let him find you." And so he stayed, his breathing steady, his posture grounded, his hand still resting near Ethan but not touching. Ava remained exactly where she was, her presence unchanged, her breathing calm and even, but her attention sharpened, focused entirely on the child between them, ready to adjust if needed, but not before. Ethan's eyes moved first, not to either of them directly, but across the space, searching, as if confirming what was still there, what had not disappeared. And when his gaze landed on Ava, there was no immediate reaction, just a quiet recognition, a soft easing in his expression, and then, slowly, his eyes shifted again, this time toward Richard. The moment stretched, delicate and unspoken, and Richard felt it in a way he had not expected, not as pressure, but as possibility, as if everything he had done, everything he had not done, had led to this single point in time. Ethan blinked once, then again, his small hand moving slightly, not reaching yet, just testing the space. And Richard resisted the urge to close the distance, to fill the gap. Instead, he remained still, letting the moment unfold on its own terms. Ava's voice came softly, barely more than breath. "Stay with him," she whispered, not a command, not even instruction, just a quiet reminder. And Richard nodded once, almost imperceptibly, his eyes never leaving his son's face. Ethan's fingers curled again, then slowly extended, brushing lightly against the air before settling closer to Richard's hand, not touching yet, but near enough that the warmth could be felt. And Richard held his position, steady, grounded, allowing the child to decide the distance. Seconds passed. And then, without warning, Ethan's hand moved just enough to rest against the back of Richard's fingers, the contact light, uncertain, but real, and something in Richard's chest shifted in a way he could not contain, not outwardly, not in movement, but internally, a quiet breaking of something rigid, something that had held him apart for longer than he realized. He did not pull away, did not tighten, did not respond with urgency. He simply stayed, letting his hand remain where it was, allowing the connection to exist without altering it. Ethan's grip did not strengthen, did not cling, but it remained, a small, steady point of contact that seemed to anchor him in the moment. And Richard felt it, not just physically, but emotionally, a weight and a lightness at the same time, something he had not known how to create before. Ava watched the interaction from the corner of her awareness, her expression softening slightly, not with surprise, but with quiet acknowledgement, as if this was the moment she had been guiding toward all along. Ethan's gaze lingered on Richard now, longer than before, his eyes no longer searching, but settling, and his breathing remained calm, steady, unbroken, and Richard realized that this was the difference, not the absence of crying, but the presence of connection, something that could not be forced, only offered and received. He adjusted his breathing again, deeper now, more natural. And for the first time, it did not feel like an effort, it felt like alignment, like something he had been out of sync with was finally beginning to fall into place. "Hi," he said quietly, the words simple, almost unfamiliar on his tongue in this context, not as a greeting, but as an offering, a presence, and Ethan blinked slowly, his fingers still resting against Richard's hand, not reacting with excitement or distress, just remaining, just being, and in that stillness, something profound settled between them. Ava shifted slightly, easing the pressure on her arm now that the moment had stabilized, but she did not move away, not yet, her role not finished, her presence still part of the balance they had created. The light in the room grew brighter, the morning fully arriving. But inside the nursery, the quiet held, not fragile anymore, but steady, supported by something deeper than before. Richard looked at his son, really looked, and for the first time, he did not feel like he was standing on the outside trying to understand. He felt like he was part of it, part of the rhythm, part of the presence that Ethan had been searching for. And as he remained there, his hand still beneath his son's small, steady touch, he understood something he had missed for too long. That sometimes the most important thing he could offer was not action, not solutions, but simply himself, staying long enough for his son to find him. Richard did not move his hand when Ethan's small fingers rested against it, not even a fraction, because he understood now that even the slightest shift could change what had just been built. And so he stayed exactly where he was, his breath steady, his posture grounded, his attention fully anchored in the quiet connection between them. Ethan's eyes remained open, soft, and alert, not searching anymore, not restless, just present, his gaze lingering on Richard's face as if recognizing something new, something that had not been there before, and Richard felt it, that recognition, not as a demand, but as an invitation he had not known how to accept until now. Ava remained still beside them, her role no longer leading, but supporting, her presence easing into the background of the moment while still holding its edges together, and she watched without looking directly, her awareness tuned to the subtle shifts that could still change everything. Richard swallowed slowly, the movement small, but deliberate, and for a moment he allowed himself to feel the weight of what had just happened, not as a victory, not as something achieved, but as something given, something fragile and undeserved that he had been allowed to step into. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly, not gripping, not clinging, but pressing just enough to confirm the contact, and Richard responded the only way he knew he should now, by not reacting, by letting the moment remain simple, steady, uninterrupted. The morning light continued to spread across the room, illuminating more of the space, revealing details that had been hidden in the night, the soft texture of the blanket, the faint lines in the marble floor, the quiet stillness of a room that no longer felt tense or heavy. He remembers this, Ava said softly after a while, her voice gentle, careful not to disturb what had settled between them. And Richard turned his head slightly, listening, not as a thought, but as a feeling. She continued, her words slow, intentional. If you stay like this, he will begin to trust that it will not disappear. Richard absorbed that, his gaze returning to Ethan, and something inside him shifted again, deeper this time, because trust was not something he had ever associated with time in this way, not something built in silence, in stillness, in simply being there. He exhaled slowly, his breath aligning again with the rhythm they had created, and for the first time, it felt natural, not forced, not practiced, but real. Ethan blinked again, his eyes still fixed on Richard, and then, slowly, his body shifted closer, not dramatically, not urgently, just a small adjustment that reduced the space between them, and Richard felt it immediately, the subtle weight of that movement, the quiet decision it represented. His hand remained where it was, steady, open, and this time when Ethan's fingers moved again, they rested more fully against his hand, the contact no longer tentative, but settled, and something in Richard's chest tightened in a way that felt both unfamiliar and deeply right. He looked at his son, really looked, and for the first time, he saw not just a child in need, but a person reaching, responding, choosing, and that realization carried a weight he could not ignore. Ava shifted slightly then, her body easing away just enough to create space, not withdrawing completely, but allowing the connection between father and son to take its own form without her constant presence at the center. And Richard noticed, his eyes flicking briefly to her before returning to Ethan, understanding without words what she had just done. The house beyond the room had fully awakened now. The faint sounds of movement, voices, the beginning of another day filtering through the walls, but inside the nursery, that world still felt distant, secondary to what was unfolding on the floor. What happens now? Richard asked quietly, not looking away from Ethan, his voice carrying a different kind of uncertainty now, not about control, but about continuation, and Ava considered the question before answering, her tone calm, steady. Now you stay, she said simply, and the words settled into the room with a quiet clarity that left no room for interpretation. Richard nodded once. The movement small but certain, and he adjusted his posture slightly, not to leave, not to change the moment, but to support it, to remain in it longer, to understand what it meant to stay not just for a moment, but for as long as it was needed. Ethan's breathing remained calm, his body relaxed, his small hand still resting against Richard's, and for the first time since the night had begun, there was no tension beneath the quiet, no anticipation of what might go wrong, only the steady presence of what was already enough. Richard allowed himself to sit in that, to feel it fully, without trying to define it or control it. And as he remained there, grounded on the cold marble floor, close enough to feel the warmth of his son, close enough to understand the simplicity of what had been missing, he realized that this moment was not something to fix or improve. It was something to continue, something to choose again and again, until it was no longer unfamiliar, until it became part of who he was. Richard did not pull his hand away even as the minutes stretched longer, even as the sounds of the house beyond the nursery grew clearer, because something inside him understood now that leaving too soon would undo what had just begun. And so he stayed, not out of obligation, not out of instruction, but out of choice. Ethan's fingers remained resting against his, the contact no longer uncertain, no longer testing, but settled in a quiet way that felt natural, as if it had always belonged there. And Richard found himself watching the smallest details with a kind of attention he had never given before. The way Ethan's breathing remained even, the way his eyes softened instead of searching, the way his body no longer carried that subtle tension he had come to expect. Ava shifted slightly further back, not leaving, but allowing space to grow between herself and the center of the moment, her presence now more like a quiet frame than the focus, and Richard noticed the change, not with confusion, but with understanding, as if he could feel her guiding the moment without stepping into it. He is choosing you, she said softly after a while, her voice calm, steady, and Richard felt those words land with a weight that was both simple and profound, because choosing implied something he had not considered before, that Ethan was not just reacting, not just needing, but responding, recognizing, reaching. Richard's breath caught for a fraction of a second, then steadied again, his gaze fixed on his son, and for the first time, he did not see himself as separate from the moment. He saw himself as part of it, as someone being seen in return. Ethan blinked slowly, his eyes still on Richard, and then his fingers shifted again, this time curling more fully around one of Richard's fingers. Not gripping tightly, not holding out of fear, but resting there, comfortable, and Richard felt it, that small, steady weight, and something inside him gave way quietly, not breaking, but opening. He lowered his head slightly, not enough to disrupt the moment, but enough to bring himself closer, his voice softer than it had ever been in this room. I am here, he said, the words simple, almost instinctive, and though Ethan could not understand the language, something in the tone, in the presence behind it, seemed to settle deeper into the space between them. Ava watched that exchange with quiet attention, her expression softening in a way that carried no surprise, only recognition, as if this was the moment she had trusted would come if given enough time, enough stillness, enough space for it to unfold. The morning light now filled the room more fully, touching every surface, removing the shadows that had once made the space feel colder, more distant, and in that light, everything felt clearer, not just the room, but the connection within it. Richard became aware of his own posture again, of the way he had lowered himself to this level, of the way the floor pressed against him, grounding him in a way that felt unfamiliar but necessary, and he did not resist it. He allowed it, understanding now that comfort was not always where meaning was found. Ethan shifted closer once more, a small movement that reduced the space between them even further, And this time, without thinking, Richard adjusted slightly to meet him, not pulling, not guiding, just aligning, allowing the connection to deepen without force. Ava slowly placed her hand on the floor and began to ease herself up, her movements careful, quiet, designed not to disturb what had formed, and Richard noticed, his eyes lifting briefly to her, a silent question passing between them. She met his gaze for a moment, her expression calm, steady, and she gave the smallest nod, not as permission, but as reassurance, and then she stepped back, not leaving the room, but stepping out of the center of it completely. Richard returned his focus to Ethan, and for a moment, there was a flicker of uncertainty, not about what to do, but about whether he could maintain what had been created without her presence guiding it. Ethan's fingers tightened slightly, not in distress, but in quiet acknowledgement, and Richard felt it, that small signal, and instead of questioning it, he responded the only way he knew how now, by staying, by breathing, by remaining steady. The silence held, not fragile anymore, but supported by something deeper, something that no longer depended entirely on Ava's presence, but had begun to take root between father and son. Richard exhaled slowly, his breath calm, his posture grounded, and as he looked at Ethan, really looked, he understood that this was the moment that mattered most, not the night before, not the struggle that had led them here, but this, the continuation, the choice to remain even when guidance stepped away. And as he stayed there, his hand still held by his son's small, steady grip, he realized that what Ava had given him was not just a way to calm a crying child, but a way to be present in a way he had never learned, a way that did not rely on control or instruction, but on something far simpler and far more powerful, the decision to stay long enough to be found. Richard remained exactly where he was even after Ava stepped back, even after the quiet structure she had held so carefully was no longer centered around her, because he understood now that this was the part that mattered most, not the guidance, not the discovery, but the continuation. Ethan's small hand still rested in his, no longer tentative, no longer testing, but settled with a quiet confidence that had not been there before, and Richard felt it as something fragile but real, something that depended not on perfection, but on presence. The room had changed, not in its walls or its light, but in its weight, the air no longer heavy with tension, but filled with something softer, something that did not demand attention but rewarded it. Richard adjusted his breathing again, slower now, more natural, no longer counting or measuring, just following the rhythm that had already been established, and Ethan's chest continued to rise and fall in quiet synchronization, as if the connection between them had found its own balance. Ava stood near the edge of the room, her posture relaxed but attentive, her presence no longer directing, but observing. And in her stillness, there was a quiet certainty, as if she knew that the moment no longer needed her in the same way. Richard became aware of that too, not as absence, but as trust, a silent step back that allowed something else to take its place. Ethan shifted slightly, his body turning just enough to face Richard more directly, his eyes still soft, still calm, and this time when he moved, Richard responded without hesitation, not by adjusting the moment, but by staying aligned with it, his hand steady, his presence unchanged. The child's fingers tightened just a fraction, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and Richard felt it as a signal, not of need, but of connection, something being held, not out of fear, but out of recognition. He exhaled slowly, his breath warm against the quiet air, and for a moment he closed his eyes, not to withdraw, but to feel, to fully register what was happening without the distraction of sight. And when he opened them again, nothing had broken, nothing had shifted. The moment still held, steady and intact. "He will remember this," Ava said softly from where she stood, her voice gentle, carrying through the room without disturbing it, and Richard turned his head slightly, listening. "Not as something you did," she continued, "but as how it felt to be with you." The words settled deeply, not as instruction, but as truth, and Richard felt them reshape something inside him, something that had been built on action, on solutions, now being replaced with something quieter, something more lasting. He nodded once, not in agreement, alone, but in understanding, his gaze returning to Ethan, who remained calm, present, no longer searching, no longer unsettled. The morning light now filled the entire room, bright but soft, illuminating everything without harshness, and in that light, the space felt open, no longer confined by the tension that had once defined it. Richard shifted slightly, not away, not to leave, but to settle more comfortably into the position he had chosen, his body adjusting to the floor, to the stillness, to the unfamiliar act of staying without an end point. Ethan responded to that shift not with distress, but with ease, his body relaxing further, his breathing remaining steady, and Richard realized that the connection did not require perfection, only consistency, only presence that did not disappear. Ava took a small step back toward the door, her movement quiet, deliberate, and Richard noticed his eyes lifting briefly to her. And again, that silent exchange passed between them, not spoken, but understood. She gave the faintest nod, her expression calm, and then she turned slightly, not leaving completely, but positioning herself outside the center of the moment, allowing father and son to remain alone within it. Richard returned his focus to Ethan, and for the first time, there was no uncertainty in his posture, no hesitation in his presence, only a quiet steadiness that matched the rhythm they had created together. The house beyond the room continued to move, the day beginning as it always did, but inside the nursery, time felt slower, more deliberate, as if this moment existed outside of everything else. Richard looked at his son, really looked, and understood something with a clarity he had not felt before, that what he was building here was not temporary, not a solution to a single night, but the beginning of something that would carry forward, something that would shape how his son felt, how he trusted, how he rested. And as he remained there, his hand still held by Ethan's small, steady grip, his breathing aligned with the quiet rhythm of the room, he realized that this was not something he needed to perfect. It was something he needed to continue, something he needed to choose again and again, until it was no longer unfamiliar, until it became part of who he was, not just in this room, but beyond it. Richard did not notice when the rest of the house fully came to life, when footsteps passed in distant hallways, or when quiet voices began their morning routines, because for him, time had narrowed to something smaller, something more precise, measured not in hours or schedules, but in breaths, in stillness, in the steady weight of his son's small hand resting in his own. Ethan remained calm, his eyes now half-lidded, no longer searching, no longer testing, but settled in a way that felt complete, as if whatever he had been reaching for had finally been found. And Richard stayed exactly where he was, not out of effort anymore, but because leaving no longer felt natural. The cold of the marble floor had faded into something distant, something his body had accepted, and in its place was a quiet awareness, a grounding that kept him present in a way he had never experienced before. Ava stood near the doorway, her figure within it. Ava took a small step closer to the door, her movement soft, unobtrusive, and Richard noticed without turning, his awareness now extending beyond just his son, taking in the full space of the room, the quiet balance that had formed within it. She paused briefly, her hand resting lightly against the doorframe, and then she spoke, her voice gentle, carrying through the room without breaking its calm. "You stayed," she said, and the words were simple, but they carried a quiet weight. Not as praise, not as surprise, but as recognition. Richard did not respond immediately, because the meaning of those words settled deeper than he expected, not as something external, but as something internal, something he had chosen without fully realizing it at the time, and now understood more clearly than ever. After a moment, he nodded slightly, his gaze still on Ethan, and his voice, when it came, was low, steady. "I will again," he said, not as a promise made for someone else, but as a decision made within himself. Ava did not say anything more. She simply nodded once, her expression calm, and then she stepped out of the room quietly, leaving the door slightly open behind her, the soft light from the hallway blending with the morning light inside. Richard remained where he was, alone now with his son, but the word alone no longer felt the same, no longer carried the same weight it once had. He adjusted his posture slightly, not to leave, but to settle more comfortably, his hand resting near Ethan, not touching, not needing to, just present. The silence in the room remained, But it was no longer something to fix, no longer something to fill. It was something to hold, something to be part of. Richard looked at his son one last time, taking in the calm expression, the steady breathing, the quiet trust that had replaced the tension of the night before, and he allowed himself to sit with that, to fully understand what it meant, not as a solution, not as a one-time change, but as the beginning of something that would require the same choice, again and again. And as he remained there, grounded on the floor, surrounded by the soft light of morning and the quiet rhythm of his son's breath, he understood something with a clarity that did not need to be spoken, that he had spent so much time trying to provide everything his son could need. But in the end, what mattered most was something far simpler, something that could not be bought or delegated, something that had